Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. While you enjoy lunch, I will talk about my research, but feel free to nibble a bit. Yeah, so I want to introduce myself. You did that very well already. So I'll jump right into the presentation itself. And I would like to start the presentation with a recent example of the Netherlands, the country I'm from. Last week, they announced that they would cut the developmental aid in the Netherlands by 2.4 billion euros. And there's a specific reason for that, because the new Dutch government, right-wing government, decided that it was important that all developmental aid given should have a direct benefit to the Netherlands. Not a benefit to other countries, no, to the Netherlands itself. Very dramatic and sort of Trumpian response, of course, but it basically means that a lot of the developmental aid will stop flowing to specific fields. And they targeted specific fields here, specifically women's rights, sports, education, cultural development, and also LGBTQI+ development and rights and programs around that. So they stopped funding those. Well, they will be cutting all budgets there. Also, specifically, they will cut all budgets to UN organizations, specifically UN Women, but also UNICEF. And well, this I think shows a bit in the direction where the Netherlands is going now with this new right-wing government, and has been going for some time already. Why do I pick this this specific example? Well, the Netherlands has this reputation of being quite definitely positive towards LGBTQ+ equality, but also taking a front-runner role in development in foreign countries as well. The UN, for example, said that the Netherlands has a unique reputation and is extremely important for the safety and rights of LGBTQI+ people worldwide. And of course, without funding, without these programs, this is likely to, this reputation is likely to be damaged, of course, but also the effectiveness of these programs will probably minimize. And this is quite interesting. As you might know, the Netherlands used to be quite a front runner when it comes to LGBTQ+ rights and equality. First country to legalize same-sex marriages. Long time ago already, but still significant development then. In 2014, it ranked 4th place on the LGA rainbow map. Is there anyone not familiar with the LGA rainbow map? If so, please raise your hand. All familiar? Okay, then I won't explain that. But basically, they were ranked 4th place in 2014 and now are in 14th place. Still, they're doing well compared to other countries. For example, if you look at Europe, Russia, I mean, you can safely say that a lot of European countries are still doing better than Russia. But it marks the shift in this idea of LGBTQ+I+ rights. From what I say in the title here, from safe haven to laggard, from front runner to someone that's behind and sort of slacking a bit on this particular field. Nice example. Well, the Netherlands is also not unique in this per se. We see that across Europe, LGBTQ+ rights are increasingly being contested. As a different reasons, different causes for that. I name here 3. So, of course, the rise of extreme and radical right, but also the rise of the anti-gender movement, for example, which is actively pushing back on LGBT and other gender-related rights. And also there's an active repression in some EU member states of civil society organizations or interest groups or interest organizations, whatever you might call them. And this sort of triangle leads to, increasingly pressure on LGBTQ+ organizations, particularly those organizations that represent LGBTQ+ people and are actively politically active in those countries. And this is basically where my research starts. And my research asks itself sort of the big main question: how do LGBTQ+ organizations, interest organizations, navigate repression and hostility? This is sort of the big question that I aim to answer, and I do that in multiple ways. And today we'll focus on one particular paper, and then also have some time left to discuss another paper. So a bit of context here. Sophie also already mentioned it, but my research is funded by the FAO and FNRS and will last for 6 years, which is a very long time for academics. So very happy about that. Hi. And the main sort of theoretical reasoning behind the project is to sort of bridge interest group literature on the one hand and social movement literature on the other hand. Both of these literatures have engaged and have studied these interest organizations, also LGBTQ+ organizations in detail, but they can still learn from each other. That's what I aim to do with this project. And the sort of more empirical take is indeed what I just discussed, this hostility or suppression, oppression of LGBTQ+I people and those that represent those people increases. And what does that do to those organizations? How do they navigate? How do they strategize in those increasingly hostile context? And that's sort of the main theoretical and empirical contribution that I aim to make in the project. Okay, the structure of this the seminar, this presentation. I'll first discuss the first paper, community care policy promotion. I'll also shortly browse through another paper that I recently published called Navigating Hostility, how topical, and then we'll come to upcoming work and some, and of course, the discussion. So first, the first paper, community care or policy promotion, explaining the dual activities of LGBTQ+ organizations. The main rationale of this paper is that we have different organizations. An example here from Brussels is Rizcallah Brussels, an active organization when it comes to LGBTQ+ rights, very active in the community. But they also, they have different projects basically. On the one hand, they have political projects in which they engage with politicians, either at the local or national level, or the regional level, of course, where they share information, try to lobby for policy change, maybe give information to policymakers to get them to engage in a certain topic, agenda setting, etc. But they also offer community services. An example here is a project, basically a helpline for people that have experienced LGBTQ+I phobia. So if there's, for example, a hate crime, you call that helpline number and they can give you support, legal support, maybe psychological support through that helpline. So these are two different types of activities. Political work on the other hand, policy promotion, and community work on the other hand, community care, hence the title. And I would like to find out, that's what I do in the paper, what type of factors, what type of elements influence whether an organization is focused more on policy work or on community work. So the research question that I asked then is, what factors explain the political and community-oriented activities of LGBTQ+ organizations in Europe? So take this broader than just Brussels or Belgium. I want to understand this on a full European scale. Okay, so theory. As I said, I try to bridge two literatures. I start with social movement literature, and with sort of, quite classical social movement literature by Deborah Minkoff. That's one of the main sort of starting points that I take in the paper. She argues that there are three organizational logics. You have different organizations that have sort of different missions, basically, different logic that they operate under. You have protest organizations. Those are organizations that organize protests, surprise, surprise. So mass demonstrations to raise awareness about a particular issue, but maybe also to reach some political change. Advocacy, she argues, that's more than political work, lobbying for policy change, having contacts, direct contacts with politicians and policymakers. Try to give them information, try to give them your policy preferences. And lastly, she argues that there are organizations that mainly do service provision, so give services to their constituents, to their members. For example, one of those helplines is an example of such an activity. And the whole argument of Deborah Minkoff is that she says, well, these logics are not that clear-cut. Well, you have these different logics, those exist, but we see a rise of hybrid organizations. In other words, organizations that combine different types of logics and might also vary over time and between contexts. And she argues that the rise of hybrid organizations is mainly the reason of exogenous factors. More on that later. So that's social movement literature on the one hand. Then on the other hand, we have interest group literature, which takes a much more organizational focus and basically focuses on different, also on organizational logics, but with a slightly different twist to it. Within interest group literature, organizations can have two types of logics: logic of influence and a logic of survival. Logic of influence is organizations trying to have an influence on public policy. One of the main reasons why interest organizations exist. They hear what their members or constituents want, and they try to communicate that to politicians and policymakers that then can take that on board or not. Right? So they want to have an influence. They can do that through various means, but they want to have influence. Secondly, those organizations also need to survive. And that's a different type of logic interest group literature argues. So instead of just communicating to politicians and policymakers, these organizations also have to sort of attract new members, be visible to new members, to citizens, and show, okay, what do we do actually? So that's a different type of logic as well. So we see that in two types of literatures, studying basically the same type of organizations, they look at these organizations slightly differently, and that's what I try to bridge. What's more to say here is that interest group literature focuses on endogenous factors, so factors that are actually bound to by the organization. That will become more clear when I introduce hypotheses. I take a sort of two-step, three-step approach maybe. First of all, I look into exogenous factors, so factors, sort of contextual factors, inspired by social movement literature. I won't go through these all now. If you have any questions, save them for the discussion. But basically, I link these different factors to, are they either more politically active or more community active? That's what we want to understand here. So one of those factors, I then look at hostility towards LGBTQI+ equality and general CSO repression. So repression of civil society organizations. And endogenous, inspired by interest group literature, I look into what type of funding do they get? Do they receive government funding or not? Do organizations actually have members themselves? So members that contribute to the organization, not just constituency, but indeed paying members, and pay a membership fee, and are sort of can hold the organization accountable as well. And then I also look into sort of interaction effect between those two and see, okay, CSO repression. If organizations are repressed, that harms them, obviously. Right? If, for example, subsidies or funding is cut from the government to an organization, that can be quite harmful to that organization. But I argue if that organization has multiple sources of funding, so besides only government subsidies, they also have membership fees, they also have the donators, so one-time donators. Maybe they have a web shop in which they can sort of gather some revenue. Different types of funding can sort of mitigate the effect. So that's sort of the logic here. Any more questions? Please save them for the discussion. Okay, so this is the general setup of the paper. We have exogenous, endogenous factors that influence whether organizations are political or community active. How did I then study this? Well, first of all, I had, of course, to first understand what type of activities there are and what type of activities these organizations actually do. So I coded the websites of 295 LGBTQ+ organizations across Europe, across 17 countries. I focus here on LGA members for practicality reasons, and also that we know that these organizations are actively still operating. More on that later. And basically, we coded with a group of students. I coded the different activities. You can see here, it's also readable on the back, but different types of activities. So, for example, raising public awareness, policy influence, so actively lobbying politicians and policymakers, litigation, legal support, another type of activity. Then towards the community activities, healthcare and prevention activities, provides safe spaces, safe houses, and leisure and relaxation. So different types of activities here. Also in this column here, the percentage of those organizations that do it. So most of them are actively engaged in raising public awareness, with 77% of organizations doing that activity. And I see, and only 19% of organizations provide safe spaces or safe houses queer people. Okay, so having mapped those activities of those organizations, I then turn into, of course, I want to measure the different factors that can influence those activities. On the one hand, we have LGBTQI hostility and CSO regression, right? Exogenous factors. I use existing databases to get the data. So the sources are linked below, and also hostility. I look into different types of hostility and make an average out of that. And then for the endogenous factors, I look again into the website coding. So because we didn't only code the activities of the organizations, but we also coded whether they receive government funding, the type of other funding that they received, and also whether they have members or not. These are the different empirical ingredients, you might say. And then putting that all in a big pot, we get something like this. So here we see some first results. We see different countries, of course, and the number of organizations that were included in the sample, and the mapped activities that we found on the websites of all those organizations. Well, not entirely surprising. We find that in the bigger countries, which have more active LGBTQ+ organizations, there's also more activities, of course. Very basic, right? So in Spain, in Italy, Germany, France, big countries, a lot of organizations are active. Well, also we map, of course, a lot of activities. What is interesting, I think, to show here, to highlight here, is that almost in all countries, the organizations are more politically active or have more political activities than community activities. Only in Finland we see a small difference here, but it's also very minimal. So we see that the organizations, or at least the activities that I mapped, are mainly political activities. Okay, this of course still splits up political and the community activities to see how groups balance different types of activities. Because yeah, as an organization, you can organize 2 political activities and engage in 1 community activity. It doesn't make you a full political organization. No, there's a mix in here, right? There's a gradient, basically, a continuous scale. And to have it also in the analysis, I make an index where the 0 means that organizations are fully politically active. So they only organize, they only partake in political activities. So lobbying, raising awareness, litigation. And the 1 means that they're fully community focused. So they are not politically active at all. And of course, there's a gradient here, so you can have a 0.4. Such as Rainbow House Brussels, which has a relative focus of 0.4, which means that it's relatively more politically focused than community focused. So they're more politically active, they engage in more in more political activities than in community activities. Is that clear? How that index tells us something about the balance that these groups undertake or make in their daily work? Very good. Then I now present you this quite dramatic graph. Don't be too intimidated. So again, we see the index here. So 0 means only political, 1 only community. And we see the different, you see the different black dots, right? Those black dots represent those organizations. And what we see here is that there's, of course, a spread between different types between different countries and different organizations. But I want to highlight 2 things. First of all, we see a lot of black dots here. Here, a couple here, big clump. So those are organizations that are only politically active. That's also what we saw in this graph, right? Mainly political activities. What we also see is that there are not as many dots on this side. So there's a limited number of organizations that are only community active. There are some, but not as many. And we see, of course, also that there's a lot of organizations in between the 0 and the 1 that combine different types of activities. Okay. This is just a visualization of what we're looking at, how the data looks like, but I think the results are a bit interesting to delve into. So what do I then find? Well, first of all, I find that LGBTQ+ hostility, surprisingly, does not affect the activities of these organizations. So I find that in countries where there is more hostility towards LGBTQ plus equality, organizations do not become more politically active, but also not more community active. So there's no real relation here. And that's quite interesting, I think. Secondly, I find that when organizations are faced with government repression, active repression of the government, for example, by cutting funding, we see that the organization becomes somewhat more community active. And this is very much in line with previous research as well. There is qualitative research that explores this relationship as well and sees that, for example, women's groups in Hungary, for example, when faced with repression, they tend to focus on community building, community activities instead of their political work. Of course, not entirely surprising if the government is very much, well, sort of closing doors and actively repressing you. You're also not very likely to become to contact politicians and policymakers in that government. So it's quite logical, but interesting to see it also here. Thirdly, I find that organizations are more likely to be community oriented or organize more community activities when they have members. So not entirely surprising if you have members, you want to show to those members that you're active and that you care for them, that you support them, that you give them services. So also that's not a quite surprising finding here. It follows the hypothesis, but interesting nonetheless. And then very carefully, also mentioned here and also in the paper, very carefully I find some preliminary evidence that the more resources, the more funding sources groups have, the better they can deal with CSO repression. Very careful here, it's only preliminary evidence, so it's not very conclusive yet, but there are hints here and there. So what are then the main takeaways of this paper? What I want you to sort of remember today. First of all, I think that the data and the analysis show that LGBTQ plus organizations are indeed hybrid organizations. They combine different types of activities, policy work, community work, but they are still maybe mainly political active. They're political organizations, so they're interest organizations, interest groups. Secondly, CSO repression indeed leads to less politically active organizations, more community focus, as also shown in other research. And this sort of contributes to the idea that marginalized groups are even further silenced. Those groups that already have a difficult footing in society, for example, women's groups, but also organizations that represent migrants, for example, in specific countries. They face repression that makes them even less politically active. And thirdly, I think there is a need for a better understanding of how organizational resources, such as funding and having members, for example, but also maybe different types of membership, can help organizations or can assist organizations in re-strategizing and still staying politically active, even though they're faced with hostility or repression. So those are the main takeaways of this paper. I'm looking at how much time you guys still have. 10 minutes. Perfect. So that was paper 1. Now paper 2. Navigating hostility. I will go through this a bit quicker. It has been published in Interest Groups and Advocacy in 2024, just last year. And here I look specifically at strategies. Give the example again, Greater House Brussels. Well, as we have seen, they're mainly politically active, right? That's what we found. Then this paper wants to understand, okay, how active are they then? Or what type of activities do they then do? Well, we distinguish between inside strategies, which means having contacts with politicians directly, policymakers directly, either through setting up meetings, phone calls, maybe organizing a lunch or whatever, maybe organizing a seminar where we can discuss certain topics, all inside lobbying, or outside lobbying. Outside strategies are more directed at the media and at the general public. So you can, for example, organize a mass demonstration, raising public awareness, maybe changing public opinion about a certain topic that concerns your organization, concerns LGBTQ plus people in Brussels. You can do that through the general public, organizing protests, but also contacting journalists, writing press releases, etc. And you can, through outside strategies, also try to affect policy making in general. But that's sort of the general logic within a lot of interest group literature, and I introduced that here as well. So then, of course, I want to know, okay, what makes that certain groups are more focusing on inside strategies, directly contacting politicians, and who are more inclined to organize outside activities, such as organizing a protest or contacting journalists. Again, a set of hypotheses. Won't go through them all, don't worry. What I look at public opinion and elite opinion. Public opinion, I don't think I need to explain very much. Elite opinion, maybe yes. Elite opinion is the opinion of policymakers, politicians, political elites towards LGBTQ plus equality. Same goes for public opinion, and I basically argue that, well, for example, if there's very negative elite opinion towards LGBTQ plus equality, it's very unlikely that those politicians are very open to talk to, let's say, Rainbow House Brussels. Yeah, they disagree so much that it doesn't have any, yeah, they basically close their door for those organizations. What does that mean? Well, that organization, Rainbow House Brussels, doesn't call on politicians, won't spend resources on that, no. We will instead organize a protest, for example, try to, through media or the public opinion, try to change the politicians' opinion about LGBTQ plus equality. Well, on the other side, if it's, for example, if you have elites that are very positive towards LGBTQ plus equality, they are more likely to invite an organization such as Rainbow House Brussels to sit on the table, to discuss policies, to discuss general ideas. Well, I also introduce here alternative strategies. Basically, if both public opinion and elite opinion are very negative towards LGBTQ plus equality, yeah, what does an organization do? They can't really sway public opinion. They can't really engage with policymakers and politicians. Well, last resort might then be litigation. So through jurisprudence, try to achieve policy change, or they may become completely apolitical and indeed focus on community services, as I then showed also in the previous one. Okay, the data then. This paper works with observational data, so survey data. I surveyed about 70 organizations in 15 EU countries, and I basically asked them the question, how much time in percentage do you spend on the following activities? They indicated that, and we see here that most organizations are active or spend their time on outside strategies, contacting media, contacting journalists, organizing protests, demonstrations. Also, a lot are active on insider strategies. So contacting politicians, having direct contact, and then very little are actually engaged in litigation. We see also that there's sort of a mix between organizations focusing on community services. This is also basically why I wanted to write the first paper as well, to see, okay, what does that mean? Okay. Then the findings. I like to focus on this first. So here we see a little graph focusing on elite opinion. What does this show? Well, if elite opinion is positive, we see that there's a big orange bar. In other words, they organize a lot of, they focus a lot, they spend a lot of time on insider strategies. Okay, fair enough. See, more than 50% of their time is then spent on insider strategies if elite opinion is positive. If elite opinion is negative, however, that decreases quite rapidly. See, much smaller orange bar, much less time spent on insider strategies. Much more time is then spent on outsider strategies on in sort of opposition to that, right? So they shift their focus really. Also a bit more litigation, but that's not statistically significant, so I will ignore that for now. Then I would like to also focus, of course, on public opinion. Does that have an effect on the strategies of these organizations? Well, we see something similar, right? When public opinion is positive, there is still a big chunk of insider strategies. If it's negative, there's a bit less, but again, not statistically significant. And this, I think, nicely shows the difference between elite opinion and public opinion and its effect on the strategies that these organizations have. Okay, so the findings, then in short, if elite opinion, so if political elites are positive towards LGBTQ plus equality, it increases inside strategies. So increases, of course, organizations contacting those politicians, those policymakers directly. Public opinion then does not affect strategies at all. So sways in public opinion, whether public opinion is negative or positive, doesn't really matter for these organizations. LGBTQ plus I hostility specifically does not affect litigation strategies. So we don't see that in more hostile contexts, there's a lot more litigation going on based on this data, right? And we found some mixed findings about the use of community activities. So what are then the key takeaways here? And then I'll slightly wrap up. Elite opinion is here sort of a key determinant of these organization strategies, whether that's positive or negative towards LGBTQ plus equality. And that's basically similar logic as we have seen with other types of interest groups, more economic interest groups. They face the same trade-off, basically. And I think this is even more important, is that LGBTQ plus organizations, based on the data that I've collected, are not affected by sways in public opinion. So whether public opinion is positive or negative towards LGBTQ plus equality does not really matter for the strategies that they use. I argue, the paper carefully argued that it might be the result of professionalization. These groups have an organizational setup in which they professionalized and have professional contacts with policymakers and politicians. Public opinion is sort of detached from it. Okay. 2 last minutes, some upcoming work for those that might find it interesting. If you do not, then you can ignore me for the coming 2 minutes. I said that I want to bridge social movement literature and interest group literature, especially relate that to LGBTQI organization. And in upcoming book chapter, I will make an attempt of doing that. We'll see how effective it is. And also, what can we learn? What can we learn from also LGBTQ plus organizations outside of Europe, outside of the US? So there's a lot of research in that. And there is also upcoming research also on the Global South, for example, and we can learn from those, from the struggles that organizations in the Global South have, because we see that there's an increasing hostility in Europe as well. And then sort of the main purpose of the project that I will be working on for the next 6 years, the backbone of the project, as I like to call it. I will conduct another survey. Will look a bit similar as the survey that I discussed with the second paper. It will, of course, focus on the strategies of these organizations, but will be a bit more professional in the sense that I would like to engage more organizations, also engage them in a bit further, a bit more detail. I'd like to make this issue specific, which basically means that I will ask these organizations to think about 2 different types of issues, one controversial issue and one not so controversial issue, and see if they then have different strategies for both of those issues, how those change over time, and also how those change, of course, between countries. Also, focus here will be on coalitions between different types of organizations in and outside Europe. So the main goal of that survey is to have some more fine-grained observational data on these organizations and move a bit beyond what we have now. Okay, so that was what I wanted to talk with you about. I'm very happy and looking forward to your comments, your questions. Shoot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.